more independent when they think about this, when they think about religion, spirituality, whatever the word is?
Well, I think realistically, people need to give themselves permission to ask questions. And frankly, people need to associate with people who will encourage them as
Yeah.
opposed to people who will squash them. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, people talk about lies and pretending and all these kinds of things. And I don't look at lies and pretending as a moral thing as much as I see it as counterproductive. So if I pretend to be X and I do a really good job of pretending to be X, I may even get the things I think I want. The problem is the people who are real kindred spirits, the people who I could learn from and help along, they don't recognize me because I'm pretending and
Yeah.
lying and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So if people want to be more independent, genuinely want to be more independent, they have to give themselves permission to be themselves. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, be yourself. Everybody else is taken.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the point of that is everybody has to feel empowered to be who they are. And if you have people around you who don't allow you to be who
Yeah.
you are, you need to be with other people.
Yeah.
You need to find yourself an environment and relationships that value you for who you are and encourage you, as opposed to conspiring with your inner naysayer that keeps pushing you down and pushing you down. No, I can't, or I shouldn't, and God knows, and this and that. I
Right.
mean, at the end of the day, I don't want to sound more, at the end of the day, you're going to die anyway. You might as well live your life in a way that you find satisfying and meaningful, as opposed to living your life and looking, better to have been a has been than a never was.
Right.
Gave it a shot, leave it all out on the field. That's how it
Right.
works.
Right. I totally agree with that. And that that changes how your days. That change. And it seems like we don't, as humans, we don't realize that our everyday actions are what lead our life, what drive our life, right? These little things that don't feel like much in the moment. But if you start to go a different direction with those little things, that's generally how I've found in my own experience how my life changes. I mean, yes, there's big things like job losses and moves and things like that, but overall, these small, it takes you some small decisions to get to the big decisions anyway. And so if you're not willing to understand yourself enough, I guess, to know what it is that you truly want, you're living a life for someone else. And that's, I mean, as you said, you even have a quote at the end of your book about a person being on their deathbed, and I think they said something like they were, upset because they weren't more like somebody else. And then the person asked them, why weren't you more like yourself? Why weren't you more yourself?
God, why didn't I behave more like Moses? And the supporter says, yeah, God made Moses. Moses was Moses. God made you to be you.
Right.
I think when people consistently get the message that we, the powers that be, parents, teachers, government, whatever it is, what we know and you don't, and you
Yes.
constantly get the message. I think it's of human bondage. The line is, it's easier for me to think that I'm crazy and everybody else is sane than for me to think that I'm sane and everybody else is
Yeah.
crazy. It's a very scary scenario. Babies are helpless. They
Right.
look to the people around them for their very life.
Right.
If that baby continually gets the message, you don't know, you're too weak, you need to be taken care of, all those kinds of things, it's very easy to not trust yourself.
Right.
And it's hard. However, again, as the Hindus say, that which you are seeking causes you to seek. The universe will meet you more than halfway. Once you start, that in Taoism, it's like, the longest journey starts with a single step.
Yeah.
Once you start little by little accumulating those little things that you mentioned just a little while ago, you'd be amazed at how the forces come together. Everybody knows what gravity is.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a moral force of gravity that works exactly the same way. We start in a particular direction, and if we're genuine and persistent, the forces start coming together to help us along. It's not always easy. It's not always painless, but at the end of the day, it's more than worth it.
Right. I completely agree. Completely agree. And as I was listening to you talk, and I touched on this a little bit earlier about how I loved in the book, you compared what goes on in like what Western religions believe versus what Eastern religions believe, because it's very easy, especially if someone has never been to any other country outside of the US, or maybe they've been outside of the US, but not to an area that is completely different spiritually or religiously in that way. And when you showed in the book, you would give an example of certain beliefs in the West and then certain beliefs in the East. And you talked in the book, and probably my favorite chapter, if I had to pick one, was the chapter about the body and the soul. And you explained that about, what Western religions, how they see it, how Eastern religions see it. And then you offered because again, we've talked about this. It's the one or the other off most of the time, right? We're only presented with, it's got to be this or it's got to be that. And you have to choose which side you're going to be on. And if you don't choose the side, you better pick the right side, because if you don't pick the right side, then the other side is going to be mad. And, it's all of these things that we're taught basically, I think, as we've grown up. But in this chapter, you give an alternative of what if it's both? What if it's both? Both options are available. And we often don't even think of that. And this helping us see through the book that just because it's done that way in where you live doesn't mean it's done like that in the rest of the world. And there are other options. There are other alternatives. And that expanding your mind in that way, I think it also helps, as we were just talking about with the day-to-day, or what we talked about with taking action, right? Because when we're in our little box, that's all we see. That's all we know. And we think that's all the world is, but that's absolutely not true.
It's interesting. What people call Christianity today has very little to do with actual Jesus teachings and things like that.
Yeah.
A lot, especially in Catholicism, it really goes to St. Paul. And St. Paul basically drew on Plato's stuff. Plato, Greek philosopher, and all this kind of stuff. But the key teaching was that you have a world of ideals where everything is perfect. And then you have matter, which is an imperfect manifestation of the ideals. So you have what is perfect, and you have what's material that is imperfect. So anytime you hear somebody saying something like, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and all those kinds of things, there's a dichotomy, a split between this is good and this is bad. Heaven, hell, all these opposites. In the East, especially in Taoism, there are no opposites that are radical like that. Everything is complementary. So good is only good insofar as it's contrasted with bad. Hard is only hard as it's relative to soft and things like that. I got to tell you, but in the West, you'll have a psychologist like Carl Jung, and what will he talk about? He'll talk about an integrated personality. He'll talk about being able to look at yourself honestly, and instead of thinking of things in terms of good and bad, you start thinking in terms of, what do I want to accomplish? What kind of energies and skills do I have? And to what extent can I have them all work together to help me? And by helping me, I help everybody around me.
Right.
That whole business of an integrated personality, integrity, integer, all these words talk about being at oneness, as opposed to a Freud who will say we have the superego that is fighting against the id, that and the ego is the neutral battleground in which all this is taking place. Instead of conflict like you have in Freud and Jung, you have harmony, which is a much, frankly, healthier and more satisfying, but also it's more productive. You can get more stuff done when you're not fighting with yourself.
Exactly.
You have enough enemies on the outside.
Right.
You fight with yourself, it makes it even harder.
Right. Totally agree. And a lot of what I talk about on this show is about helping people. The intention is to help people change their thoughts, which then in turn changes their reality. Right. And something occurred to me as I was reading your book, and you have a section on quantum physics, the particle theory, where when the beam is shot, they try to see where it's going to go. It basically changes based on the perception of it, whoever's perceiving it. Is that explained correctly?
Pretty much. I'm not going to pretend like I really understand it, but the key takeaway from that whole thing is that if you look at Newtonian physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, all this kind of stuff. There's no room for freedom. Everything is predictable.
Yeah.
Everything is a formula. The fact of the matter is, by observing behavior, by observing objects and things like that, at some level, somehow we affect exactly what happens. Well, exactly what you're talking about is, in terms of your audience, is exactly that quantum physics model, as sophisticated as that sounds, in terms of human behavior. Depending on what your attitude is, it changes the results.
Exactly.
And it makes all the difference.
Totally. And so as I was hearing you talk about the Freud way of thinking versus the Jung way of thinking, we all have a choice, and goes back to free will, because we can choose. Do we want to believe the us versus them, or do we want to believe that more integrated, as you were talking about, way of being, and being able to come from that perspective? And we all have a choice in this, no matter how you were raised or brought up or whatever. As an adult, you can start thinking about this differently. And I'm not sure why that because I've known those two things separately, of that particle theory and then changing your thoughts to change your life. But in reading your book, it pulled it together for me, as if like that's like the ultimate truth. Like, how can you, like, if you believe that, if they've done those studies, how could you not see that your life is so affected by your thoughts in any other way? How could it be any different? That's the thought that came to me.
Well, don't forget, we were all brought up. I'm sure you saw the same cartoons and stories I had, where you had an angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder, and you had to choose which one, to follow, and this and that.
Yeah.
Years and years. It's very sinister in terms of that kind of training. The notion that, you can bring the devil and the angel together, that both bring strengths to it, it's a completely different mindset. People who don't want to accept that invariably have a vested interest in X, whatever X is. Most people who write books, most people who run churches and synagogues and mosques and all these different people, they want you to do and follow what they're telling you to do. And right away, that's got to be a signal that that's not what I want.
Right.
I want somebody to help me find out what I want. I don't want somebody to tell me that they have the answer, I should follow them. But that's very hard. The only nice thing about the universe, as it were, is that the universe will help us if we give it a shot. If we give it a chance, the universe will conspire with our better integrated selves to come toward unity, as opposed to everything is division. I mean, what do you see in the United States today? Everything's polarized.
Yes, completely.
It's either this or it's that. It's this or it's that. And the notion that we can compromise and come together for something that will work, it's completely out of the media, right? It's just not there. If you're a moderate, you're a fence sitter and you're a loser. I mean, that whole mindset, you grow up with it day in and day, it's very difficult to resist.
Well, and that's what you were just talking about with even just any situation, right? There's never the consideration that both people can actually be right based on their perspective, their experiences, whatever they're dealing with. And so that separation, that's something I really in my own life try to pay very close attention to not fall into that trap. I mean, it's not always easy because we're brought up that way. So that's what we're conditioned to do. But once you start seeing that polarization, how that's celebrated in some way, and you're aware of it, then you can start to pull yourself out of it in some cases, where you can realize that it's not worth my energy or my effort to fight against somebody, because first off, it's unlikely I'll change their opinion anyway. And second off, they get to have their opinion, just like I get to have my opinion. And so I'm not the opinion moderator where I'm going to go around telling everybody how to think.
Right. I think it's, again, remembering that death is something that awaits us all. Yeah, we have precious little time. And do we really want to spend what time and energy we have trying to convince somebody else that they're wrong, they're right? Right. It's just not worth it.
No, I know. I want to touch on one more thing before we wrap up today, because this was also a big theme from what I got from your book, and just even your background, was how you have a specialty in making very complex ideas available to anybody who wants to learn. And I 100% definitely agree.